Welcome back to this episode of Better Automated Acceptance Testing with Serenity Screenplay. And in this episode, we'll be looking at how to query web elements, how to do assertions on the web elements on the page, and to establish whether the page is in the state that we expect it to be. Serenity comes with a rich library of components that you can use to query the web page. Here's an example of the one that you saw in the previous example, where we used the target class, which provides a number of methods that let you check just the value of a web element. Here we're checking the text value. So in this case, we have the target text of, and then we're going to pass in the target object that we saw earlier on, in this case the origin field, and we're checking it using a Hubgraph matcher against London Paddington. In this case, when you do the assertion this way, you're actually exposing the target or the page object element inside the test level, and for a larger test you may not want to do that. You may want to have something a little bit more concise, in which case you can do what we did in the previous exercise, where we use a factory method. We group these target text of calls into a single class, and we refer to them using business domain related methods like origin and destination in this case. And this makes it a little bit easier for other people to use. They don't have to know which field needs to be checked for the origin and the destination. They can just use a DSL type language where they say the outbound journey summary.origin and so forth. There are quite a few options when it comes to using the target class. So the target methods actually include text of, which we saw, but you can also get the value attribute. You can get the selected value in a drop-down list. You can get the selected visible text of a drop-down list. You can even get all of the selected options in a multi-select drop-down. You can get an attribute with a particular name, or you get the CSS value with a particular name. So you get quite a lot of variety with regard to what information you want to get out of the elements. The other side of the coin is you need to be able to check whether an element is visible, whether it is enabled, whether it is present on the screen. And in Serenity Screenplay, you do that using a class called the Web Element Question class, which creates a question object, a special question object that is specialized in talking about the state of a web element. So you can say web element question the outbound journey summary origin. That will get you a question about the state of the web element. And then we have a set of matches, our web element state matches, which have a whole lot of options. Here we're seeing is visible, but we'll see there are a lot more that check the state of that element. And what this does when you use a static input is it gives you a nice readable DSL where you can say things like, Tracy should see that the outbound journey summary origin is visible. And is visible is not the only thing you can check. You can also check is currently visible. Now the difference between is visible and is currently visible is that is visible will give the application the benefit of the doubt. If the field is not visible immediately, it will wait until wait a few seconds. It's a configurable option. You can say how long you want to wait for. That's in the implicit wait system parameter. But by default, it will wait for a couple of seconds to see whether it will appear because of some sort of asynchronous activity. If you say is currently visible, that means you're sure it should be there right now, and if it's not, then fail the test immediately. You also have is enabled and is currently enabled, which are the equivalent check, but to see whether an element is enabled in the HTML sense, which can be useful for fields or buttons and so forth. Is present is a check to see whether the element is physically on the page, but it may not be visible. And is selected will check whether an element is selected or not. There are also two other related to the text content of an element. You can say contain text and contains only text. These will check the text, rendered text of a web element and see what's in there. It's good for checking bodies of text or divs that contain messages, for example. And you can also check whether an element contains a certain number of options in a select. If you have a drop-down list which is variable, you may need to check whether it's containing the right values, and that's what you would use this for. So now we're going to have a look at some live code to see all this in action. I've come back to when planning a trip, and I'm going to have a look at the request assisted travel test, where we have Tracy, who's chosen to request assisted travel, and she attempts to enter her details as Dr. Tracy Traveller. If we have a look at the implementation of this class, we'll see that we're selecting some elements in a drop-down list, and then we're entering the first name and the last name into the full name page. What we want to do now is to check that the first name has been entered correctly, or check that the full name has been entered correctly. To do that, we're going to use the assertions that we saw earlier on. So we can say something like Tracy should. Now what should she do? She should see that. You notice that see that needs a question, and that's what the target class will provide us. So we can have the target, and we want to get the value because this is a form, it's a input field, and we want the value of this particular field. And we get the value from the full name field. Once we have this value, or more precisely, we have the question about the value, we can go Tracy Traveller. That is what we expect to be in the field. And we wrap this in a Humcrest assertion. And now we have a very readable assertion. You should see that the value of assisted traveller page full name is Tracy Traveller. If I refactor this static method away, I can see that value of full name is Tracy Traveller. I'll run this just to make sure it works. And so we have a passing test. The next thing I want to check is the title. So I'm going to do something like this. See that, and rather than the value, I want the selected value. Here we have some of the options: target selected value, selected options, selected visible text value. In this case, let's go for selected visible text value of assisted travel page title. We want to make sure that that is Doctor. Again, let's run that to see if it works. And once again, we have a passing test. Here we have two examples of the target methods. There are half a dozen other ones that you can try. So in the exercises, I recommend you experiment with some of the other ones. The CSS value name, the attribute value, the text of, and so forth, just to see what else you can do with this. For the next test, we'll be going back to our buy tickets page, and we'll be checking out some of the default values that are displayed when you go to buy a ticket. First of all, I want to check out, for example, the title is correctly displayed and that this radio button is set to signal. If I have a quick look at this with the Chrome inspector, I can see that the title is an H2 element with a class of planner underscore title. And this guy, a radio button, I'll see that the radio button is actually a label that refers to a radio button, which is actually hidden, but the radio button itself has an ID of signal. And we'll also be able to see that this radio button has the same pattern. It's got a label, which is what's going to receive the clicks, and the ID of return. So that should be easy enough to identify in our code. Let's have a look at the code and see what we can do. I've opened up the ticket type form class, which is our page object for the ticket type page that we just saw. And this is where we had the from and the to fields that we used earlier on. And I've added 3 new targets, one for heading, one for the signal radio button, and one for the return radio button. So you can see these are simply using the CSS locators that we spotted earlier on. Now what I'd like to do is write a test that checks the default values for this form. Here we have the test that I want to use. Sensible default trip values or trip options are proposed. I've got Tracy to display the booking page. So we've got Tracy has chosen to book a ticket, which will get her to the booking page. What I want to check now is that she sees the correct default values. So I'd be looking at something like Tracy should see that. First parameter is a question, and we are going to be asking a web element question. The way we get hold of a web element question for a target is to pass in the. Now we're going to pass in the target that we're interested in, ticket type form, and let's pass in the heading. And I want to know that the heading is visible. So I'm going to use the web element state matches is visible method. If I run this, it should pass. And so we now have a passing test. A simplification we can do is to do static imports for all of these web element question methods, particularly the, so just static input for the, and all the web element matches methods, which means I can have a nice compact line, should see that the ticket type form heading is visible. We also need to add something similar for the radio buttons. We're going to say see that the ticket type form signal button, and we want the signal button to be selected. And we also want to check that the ticket type form return button is not selected. So we can use the same is selected. We're going to have to wrap it in the matches. So we choose the Homecrest matches not is selected, and we wrap all that around it. And of course, we can make that a static import. And now we have a set of assertions that checks all 3 states: is visible, is selected, is not selected. Let's just check that that runs again. And so we have another passing test. These are just a couple of the selectors and matches that we have at our disposition. There are quite a few others that you can experiment. Rather than saying is visible, for example, we might say is currently visible, which in this case would do the same thing. But if there's any delays or AJAX or asynchronous activity going on, this one will check that it is there at this point in time and won't hang around if it's not. It will fail immediately if it's not there, which can produce better test performance in the case of failing tests. Instead of is selected, we might add is enabled to see that the element, the HTML element, is enabled. We could also check the contents of this field. So we could say something like contains text, or contains only text, depending on how strictly we want it to be. Or we could say buy tickets. Now let's run this and see if it works. And we have a passing test. In this lesson, we've had a look at the support that Serenity provides for WebDriver integration. You get WebDriver specific questions and matches that let you query the state of your application through the web interface. We've seen how you can use the target class to create custom WebDriver questions for your target objects. And we've seen how the web element state matcher classes gives you a range of matches that you can use to check the state of different elements on the page. In the exercises, you'll be able to play around with these concepts in more detail. This is John Smart signing out until next time.